From the Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Ferreira is lost to us. He renounced God in public and surrendered the faith.
That's not possible. Father Ferreira risked his life to spread our faith all over Japan.
It seems to me that our mission here is more urgent than ever. We must go find Father Ferreira.
This is in your hearts, then, both of you. Then I must trust God has put it down.
This is Martin Scorsese's new film, Silence. It's based on a novel by Shūsaku Endō about a couple of Portuguese Jesuit priests in 17th century Japan. The movie is a harrowing 2 hours and 41 minutes, but it's also brilliant. Liam Neeson plays Father Ferreira, a Jesuit who recants his faith after being tortured. And Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver play two younger Jesuits on a mission to find their mentor.
Yeah, this is a really powerful film. And after these two land in Japan, they not only witness the torture of Japanese Christians, but they themselves are then captured and tortured. And just like their mentor, Ferreira, they have to wrestle with the question of whether or not to renounce their faith in order to save their lives or other people's.
While this story is fictional, it is based on a very real history of Christianity in Japan, where Christian faith was brutally suppressed from about 1600. And actually, the history is fascinating. 250 years later, when Japan opened up to the outside world and Catholics started to arrive again, it turned out that there were all these hidden Christian communities who had passed down their faith in complete secrecy for 7 generations. And some of their descendants still practice that particular brand of Christian faith today, even though they don't have to be hidden anymore.
For the film, the actors underwent intensive preparation to really inhabit their characters. This included a 7-day silent retreat in Wales.
Yeah, and I read an interview with Andrew Garfield where he said that the majority of the process was praying. He said, I had a year to get ready to go and shoot, and I prayed for a year. So I'm guessing this is not routine preparation for a Hollywood film.
Helping the actors with their preparation was Father James Martin. He's editor-at-large of America magazine and a prolific Jesuit presence on Facebook and Twitter.
Jim Martin.
Yes, hello. This is Simon Smart calling from Sydney.
And I'm Natasha. Nice to meet you.
How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Let me find a place to talk. Hold on.
Okay. To kick things off, we thought we'd go back to basics and ask Jim, what is a Jesuit and why did he want to become one?
Sure. The Jesuits are a Catholic religious order who live in community and take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we're probably best known, in different parts of the country, including Australia and New Zealand, for our educational work, so for high schools and colleges, for example, and retreat houses, and we sometimes run parishes as well. And what made me want to enter the Jesuits is I was working in the business world for about 6 years and, really found myself pretty miserable and started to look into priesthood and religious orders and stumbled upon the Jesuits and their way of doing things and their way of what's called finding God in all things really appealed to me. So at the beginning it was what they did, to be honest. They're running schools and missionary work and social justice stuff, but really in the end it was about their spirituality, which was really very appealing to me.
So, Father Jim, how did you come to be working on the film Silence? Film consulting doesn't immediately sound like the sort of thing priests get into, but tell us about that.
Well, Martin Scorsese's office called me, I guess in 2014. His research assistant named Marianne Bauer was starting to do research for Silence, which is a movie based on a novel by Shūsaku Endō. And I certainly read the book, and I'd heard that Scorsese was planning to do a movie on it or was thinking about doing a movie on it. So I naturally was interested in helping. And so at the beginning, I basically just helped her with some of the questions about what a Jesuit was and how Jesuits think and pray and act. And I have a book called The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything that they used. And then that morphed into helping Martin Scorsese and his co-screenwriter, Jay Cox, on the script to make sure that it was accurate in terms of portraying the Jesuits, Not so much the historical stuff, because that was handled by other Jesuits and other historians, but the spirituality and what Jesuits would say and what they would think and how they would pray. And then the third stage was helping the actors prepare for their roles as Jesuits, especially Andrew Garfield, who was the lead, who played Father Rodrigues. I spent about a year with him, directing him through what's called the spiritual exercises, which is a kind of extended retreat. So it was a lot of fun, and then just sort of fielding questions on the fly, as it got closer and closer to opening.
Yeah, so that must have been, I wonder if you at the beginning were a bit nervous about how they might portray the Jesuits, because as you know, people sometimes portrayed in film isn't quite how you might have hoped, but that wasn't your experience, I gather.
No, I thought it was very accurate. I knew that I'd read the book, so the book, has a certain portrayal of the Jesuits, very serious and adventurous and brave and thoughtful and prayerful. So I knew that the book did a good job, a pretty good job, I think, of portraying the Jesuits. It's a bit dark. I think the book's a little too dark for my taste. And I knew that Scorsese, he's pretty much the greatest, I would say, filmmaker of our time, would try to do his best. He's also religious. I knew he was Catholic and a practicing Catholic, so I knew he wasn't going to, make a hatchet job, as we say. When I read the script, though, there were some places that really needed some, I would say, help or support in terms of helping to make it more Jesuit. I would say, a Jesuit wouldn't say that here. A Jesuit would say this, and this is the kind of prayer that a Jesuit would use. This is the kind of reaction a Jesuit would have, and so I was really just trying to help them get it as accurate as possible. But I wasn't too worried about it, because I knew, if Martin Scorsese can't do a good job with your book, then, what hope do you have?
Tell us a little bit, you said you worked closely with Andrew Garfield. Listeners might know him from films like Spider-Man and Hacksaw Ridge, and you were his spiritual director. Now, you mentioned this, but what did it actually involve? What did you do with him?
Well, spiritual direction is basically accompanying people and helping them understand their prayer and helping them reflect on their experience of God in their daily life and in their prayer. But what I did was a little more specific. St. Ignatius Loyola, who is the founder of the Jesuit order, originated something called the spiritual exercises. And they're usually a month to several months process where you imaginatively place yourself in scenes from the gospel and so lead yourself through the life of Christ. And so, for example, let's say you're imagining Jesus doing a certain miracle. You would say, all right, I really try to imagine myself there, for an hour in prayer. What does it look like? What am I sort of seeing? What do I smell? What do I hear? What do I feel? What do I taste? What do I touch? And to really insert yourself as far as possible in the scene. And so Andrew and I went through basically the life of Christ through the spiritual exercises, which also includes other meditations, for about 6 or 7 months. And it was really transformative for him. So it was a great preparation for him for the movie, but also just for life in general.
Jim, in terms of consulting on the script and advising the writers on what a Jesuit would or wouldn't say or think, does that mean there's a lot of continuity between being a Jesuit in the 17th century and being one today?
Well, certainly there's some distance in terms of time, of course. As you're saying, it's, 4 centuries or 3 centuries behind us. And also culture. I'm not Portuguese, and I'm not working in Japan, and I've never set foot in Japan. But the great commonality is the spiritual exercises and the spirituality. And so, for example, early on in the script, the main character, in a sense, complains that he's suffering. And I said, well, there's no way that would happen, because part of the spiritual exercises is imagining yourself in the life of Christ and trying to pattern yourself after Christ's life, like all Christians do. And, knowing that suffering is going to be part of the story. Suffering is going to be part of Jesus' life, and it's part of your life. And so a Jesuit would never be tripped up by that and say, oh, my gosh, I'm suffering so much. Now, the question in the movie is what happens when others suffer. But those are the kinds of things that, I was pretty confident that anyone who had gone through the spiritual exercises would know.
Mm. Yeah, that's pretty amazing that, you'd go through the same training now that they did 400 years ago, and there's kind of that connection. I want to ask you about mission, I know you've written really powerfully about this. This idea of mission and missionaries within our culture, that's quite a foreign idea and even an offensive one. Can you help us to understand why were priests even there in Japan or elsewhere? Is this, a Western colonialism thing? There's probably some truth to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that, but mostly they were there to help introduce people to Christ. And so, the missionary history is very complex, but, from my point of view, I always ask people this: look, would you leave everything that you had in the world, everything that you know, your culture, your family, your friends, your language, your food, your country, everything, to go across the world at great danger to yourself in these, ships that would, travel was very dangerous back then, in order to meet people that you'd never met and who people back home thought were probably not even worthy of, your time, to preach the gospel to them. And to me, the missionary act is an act of great generosity. I mean, real selflessness. So yeah, sometimes they came with the colonial powers. I mean, that was inevitable because the colonial powers would settle or colonize these places, and then the missionaries would come. But they weren't coming to colonize. I mean, they were coming to preach the gospel and to try to help people. And by the way, the second part of that story is: would you be willing to do all that if it meant that you could probably be tortured and die? So this is this great heroic act, I think, that the missionaries do.
Yeah, I suppose it's hard for people to understand today because it's within our culture, telling someone what to believe or trying to convince them of what you believe is in itself an offensive act.
Well, I don't think it's telling someone. I think it's basically, the missionaries knew that they were going to go over and be accepted or rejected. I mean, it's sharing something with them. It's saying, this is what I believe, and I'd like to invite you into this. I mean, the missionaries, we have to be clear, the missionaries were not saying, if you don't convert, we'll kill you. Frankly, that was in historical and in the novel, that's the Japanese who are killing the Jesuits and killing the Japanese Christians. So it's actually quite the opposite. The missionaries are not imposing anything on them. The missionaries are really inviting these people into, just looking at Jesus. And they're giving them, in their eyes, the most precious gift they have, and they're doing it they are helping, in their eyes, they're helping people, at risk to their lives. They're willing to give their lives so that other people might know Jesus. So I think it's really heroic.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're speaking with Father James Martin, who worked as a consultant and spiritual advisor on Martin Scorsese's new film, Silence.
And what would you do for them? Pray? And get what in return? Only more suffering. A suffering only you can end. Not God.
Go away from me.
I pray too, Rodrigues. It doesn't help. Go on. Pray. But pray with your eyes open.
So, Jim, what was it like for you watching the film for the first time?
Yeah, it was pretty overwhelming, actually. It worked on several levels on me. I had to think about it. I cried through the movie and cried at the end. And I had to say, what is going on? What am I feeling? And I felt, first of all, the story is beautiful. So just the story and the plot and the novel and the characters and the movie is beautiful. Second, it's a beautiful work of art. I mean, Martin Scorsese makes beautiful movies, and there are some scenes that are just stunning. Third, I knew the actors, and especially Andrew. I knew all that Andrew had gone through. We went through together. And fourth, it's about Jesuit brothers and Jesuits that are my heroes, who are the martyrs, of Japan. And then also, I think there was a kind of relief that it had gotten done. That we had worked on it. I was not the only Jesuit that worked on the film. And so, we really sort of poured our hearts and soul into it, and there was kind of a relief, too. So really kind of overwhelming, really, really very, very hard to take in.
Jim, what do you think this film has to say to people, whether they're religious or not, about the nature of faith?
Well, yeah, and I would say it's different for a religious person, for a believer and a non-believer. For a non-believer, I think it might be difficult to enter into the movie, quite frankly, because the plot of the movie is, will the Jesuits recant their faith by stepping on an image of Jesus or Mary, and so save the Japanese Christians who are in peril. And I think a non-believer would say, well, why don't they just step on that thing? What's the big deal? A non-believer, I think, would be able to enter into the story and the struggle of Father Rodrigues as the main character. But I think that it would be difficult for them to fully enter into the movie. I think for a believer, it's going to raise very important questions. First of all, what would I do in that situation? Second of all, what does it mean to really discern and to try to figure out what God wants in a complex situation? And finally, I think it's a movie about real spirituality. That is, I think fake spirituality, which is really peddled in a lot of movies, is, if you only believe in God, nothing will go wrong. Or if something goes wrong, all you have to do is believe in God and pray and everything will be fine.
Right.
I think real spirituality is you can believe in God and, things may go wrong. And then what?
Yes, and spectacularly wrong in these cases.
Like in life itself.
Right.
Do you see something beautiful in that kind of martyrdom?
Yeah, I do, actually. You might say, imagine someone who has an autistic child. And imagine that child can't care for himself or herself, or maybe even a more profoundly disabled child who soils himself and, has to be fed. And you see this person, the parent, spending years just pouring themselves out. It's a sacrifice. It's basically they're pouring themselves out. It is a kind of sacrifice. It is a kind of martyrdom. It's a different kind of martyrdom. The kind of martyrdom we're talking about in Japan would be people who poured themselves out and sacrificed themselves for people that they loved in a different way. But both things are kind of beautiful. I don't think death is naturally beautiful. I don't think the fact that they're dying is beautiful, and nor do I think that the fact that an autistic, severely disabled child, can't take care of himself is beautiful, or that the parent has to endure sleepless nights and, get sick himself or herself and worry is beautiful. But the love that is behind that sacrifice is beautiful. So that's how I see it. It's in that same genre of people pouring themselves for other people that they love.
When I was watching the film, I kept thinking, what would I do in this situation? Would I tread on the image like the authorities are telling me to? Is that something that you found yourself confronted with as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, definitely. I found myself in the book when I read the novel, being asked that question. And, I interviewed Martin Scorsese in front of a group of Jesuits, about 300 Jesuits at a province gathering in New York. And one of the questions from the audience was, would you step on the image? And his immediate response was, if Jesus asked me to, which is maybe giving a little bit away about the movie. But you can't separate what he does, which he does only after a great deal of prayer and discernment and, really agonizing sort of decision-making, with what he feels God is asking him to do, finally. So it's not something he just decides on his own kind of calculus. It's something that he decides in prayer with God. And yeah, I mean, it's, there have been a lot of people on the right who have taken issue with the film, saying it glorifies apostasy or letting go of your faith. But, he's doing it to save the lives of other people. So I think, had I been in his situation exactly, I would have done the same thing.
Well, Father Jim Martin, it's so great to get to speak to you about this film. We were all deeply impacted by it, and we loved talking to you about it. Thanks so much for giving us some time to do that today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you've been listening to Life and Faith with Simon Smart and Natasha Moore.
For our Australian listeners, Silence is in cinemas now. It's pretty intense, I'm giving you fair warning, but it's also quite a unique experience.
If you want to listen to this conversation with Father James Martin again, or recommend it to a friend, you can find us online at publicchristianity.org, or on iTunes, just type Life and Faith in the search box to find us.
Next week, we're looking at a topic that's incredibly politicised, but we're coming at it from a very different angle to the usual debate. Join us for a conversation about abortion with a woman who's dedicated her life to caring for those who've been through it.